Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar on mindful communication at work. My name is Molly Buss, and I'm the Community Relations Manager at the Earl E. Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. And my role for this webinar is to moderate the chat. As you get settled, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat, perhaps sharing where you're joining us from or what you're excited to learn about today. I want to give a quick introduction of the Bakken Center for those who may not be familiar with our work. It is our vision to advance the health and well-being of individuals, communities, and organizations through integrative health and healing. And we strive to provide free and accessible resources and webinars, and we need your help to continue to do this work. So if you're able to, please consider making a donation of any amount, and I will provide the link in chat to do that, and also send some more information in the post-webinar email. There are a few logistical items to cover. You're welcome to share your thoughts and comments via the chat box. If you're comfortable and you do want to share your responses with all attendees, please make sure to update the to field in the chat box to all panelists and attendees. And then just note that there's a Q&A icon where you can submit your questions, and we'll ask our presenter as many as we have time for at the end of this session. We will send out an email with a recording of the webinar and some other mindfulness at work resources later today. I'm now delighted to introduce Dr. Mary Jo Kreitzer, founder and director of the Bakken Center for Spirituality and Healing. Mary Jo will be facilitating the Q&A segment, and will also share some more information about our presenter.
Well, thank you very much, Molly, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Wellbeing webinar series. As Molly has said, for more than 25 years, we have been advancing health and well-being in people, organizations, and communities. And we're very excited to be hosting as our speaker today, Mariann Johnson, who will share a presentation titled Mindful Communication at Work, an approach for creating more inclusive and engaged teams. The Bakken Center has long been committed to well-being in the workplace. In addition to many academic courses, we offer many community courses focused on well-being, leadership, mindfulness, and workplace well-being. Our community class, Mindfulness at Work, is now a self-paced course that's offered completely online. In today's webinar, Mariann will share about methods of mindful communication that support meaningful connections and will offer practical tips and approaches to communicating more mindfully at work. So feel free at any time to start putting your questions into the Q&A function. And after Mariann speaks until about 10 minutes to the hour, then we'll stop and we'll do a Q&A. So it's my honor truly to introduce my colleague, Mariann Johnson. Mariann's a mindfulness and well-being instructor at the Bakken Center. Prior to joining us at the Bakken Center, Mariann served as a mindfulness facilitator and manager for Moment Health, a United Health Group Ventures program. And she also was a founding member and senior instructor for the Institute for Mindful Leadership, originally piloted out of General Mills. Mariann has practiced mindfulness meditation for over 25 years and has studied with national and international leaders in the field. She has completed extensive mindfulness-based stress reduction teacher trainings through the Center for Mindfulness at the University of Massachusetts, founded by Jon Kabat-Zinn. Welcome, Mariann.
Thanks so much, Mary Jo, and Molly as well. And I'm really happy to be here today with all of you to talk about mindful communication and specifically its application in the workplace and really as an approach for creating more inclusive and engaged teams. I think something that we're all interested in doing. So let me just go over a few highlights of what we'll cover today. I want to broadly explore human communication. I think it would take at least a week to really do that justice, but I'm just going to broadly talk about it, some of its rewards and challenges, things you probably already know, but just reminding ourselves of some of those central concepts. And then I'd like to review what mindfulness is. Actually, mindfulness as a basis for what we're calling mindful communication. and then learn some principles and processes for mindful communication. I'm going to introduce to you a mindful meeting process and what I think is really a critical point in effectively running or participating in a mindful meeting, and that's guidelines, the container in which we hold our conversations. And I'll also provide some practical mindful communication and mindful meeting tips along the way. And then we'll leave some time at the close also to get some of your questions. And I have a feeling there's quite a few people listening today who also hold a lot of wisdom when it comes to mindful communication and mindful meetings. So it's not just your questions, it's also some of your sharing and comments maybe at the end. And we'll try to take some as we go along here as well. But since the topic of this is also mindfulness, I thought I'd give us all just a moment to be here now, a moment to arrive. This will be helpful for me too. I've had a busy morning, just like many of you have. And I know many people jump from one Zoom session to the next or one engagement to the next. So let's all just take a couple of deep, full, and satisfying in-breaths and out-breaths together. Maybe make a little sound with that out-breath as a real letting go or release. No one can hear you. Just settling in, maybe feeling the fact that you're sitting here now, your feet on the floor, the weight of your body being held and supported by the chair. Arriving right here, right now. When you're ready, letting the fuller, deeper breaths go and just resuming that vital, natural, rhythmic quality of your breath. Thank you. We're here now. Mindfulness often, as you know, has that expression, be here now. So really happy you're here. And maybe you just want to plant a little intention for you over the next hour, maybe the rest of the day to be at ease and be here now. So I want to talk a little bit about human communication. And I'd like to start out with two questions. And I'm going to have you just use chat. This is a relatively large group, but we can do that. And I'm going to ask you to follow along in chat as well. And Mary Jo's going to chip in here. But I want you to start with this question. What's present when human communication is effective? Your own experience, just a word or a phrase in chat. Let's just start with that question first. What's present when communication is effective? What's present? And if you would please just go into chat, put in a word or a phrase. You know, it doesn't have to be brilliant. And then just look at what other people are putting in and noticing there some of the distinctions, similarities, differences, how we all see it. These are really great. I'm having fun listening.
Yeah, so Mariann, I'm seeing a lot of empathy, listening, being present, kindness, peace. So relationship really comes up strongly. Connection.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Mary Jo. And thank you, everyone, for contributing. Now, let's go to the flip side of that same question. What gets in the way of communicating effectively? And I want to say, especially when it matters most, what gets in the way? What do we know already about this? Let's not forget those gifts of what's present, you know, but what also gets in our way? So again, in chat, just a word or a phrase, make it simple. We're not looking for perfection.
Distraction, fear, and ego are coming up many times, repeatedly. Perfectionism, that's an interesting one. Frustration, judgment, I've seen that a few times. Distractive thoughts, so not being present. Multitasking, mindset. Unwillingness to be changed by the other. That's powerful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Mary Jo, for those wonderful, that notion of perfectionism. We could go into each one of those that Mary Jo just mentioned really deeply, but I'll just touch on perfectionism, particularly in the workplace. There's such an emphasis of our wanting to look good and show up as competent that oftentimes we'll forget that we're also human beings and that being vulnerable can also be a powerful strength. And many of you I know that. So I want to jump now into some rewards and challenges. So one of the things that we know is that when things really matter, when we're under, there's a lot of pressure on us, we can experience stress. And when we experience stress in human communications, accurately hearing and remembering what was said declines rather dramatically, as a matter of fact. We also experience what's known as cognitive simplification. With the more stressed out we are, the more reactive we might be or distracted, feeling stress, we activate the amygdala, the more primitive part of our brain. And we can go into what's known as, some of you probably know, amygdala hijack, which literally shuts down some of the functioning of our prefrontal cortex, which is where we remember our active listening skills and how to give good feedback and all those things that we learn in those good classes we've attended and good trainings. They kind of go bye-bye. So if you've ever experienced that lack of memory or fuzzy brain or fuzzy thinking, you know why, whether you're communicating one-on-one or in a group setting when things get a little hot. It can be vulnerable to be face to face with another human being with strong feelings and emotions exist, and the outcome's uncertain. For most of us, that sense of ambiguity, we tend to avoid conversations when we're afraid we might, make a mistake or say something inappropriately. So there's a lot of vulnerability and risk there. So that's a normal kind of challenge that many of us face. And when people feel heard, their defensiveness is reduced. So isn't that cool? Sense of isolation and sense of self-esteem actually increases. And once that happens, and I might add, only when that happens can we become more resourceful problem solvers. I spent many years of my life facilitating and doing mediation. So I'm going to be bringing some of those experiences and some of those examples perhaps as we move through here today. But I certainly saw that one, that once people feel heard, and only when they felt heard can they then become really good problem solvers, collaborative problem solvers. Mindful communication can be a workout. There's a person who's no longer at the U, but his name was Ralph Nichols, and he was a communication professor here. And he used to say that really actively listening and really being present in communication burns calories, right? He had some interesting research on that, but we all know it takes energy, it takes effort, it takes intentionality. So let's take a look at a reward here too. As human beings, we have a deep psychological need for human connection throughout our lives. So our survival is based on that as infants, of course, but that human connection and emotional bonds remain vital to our well-being throughout our entire lives. We know that communication has power, tremendous power on many levels. But one is that communication can calm our central nervous system, or it can activate our central nervous system. Calming, leaning into that parasympathetic, the part of the central nervous system that knows how to calm, or activate the sympathetic, the stress-related part of our nervous system. Little trivia here. We speak about 125 to 150 words a minute, but the mind can process up to 500 words per minute. That leaves kind of a gap there. So if you've ever noticed how easy it is for the mind to wander off, maybe that's part of it. Also, our minds just love to think and wander. They're wired that way. So bring all those things together, and that ability to really focus our attention. And then given the distractibility and the busyness of our lives and 24/7 connectivity, oh yes, and this year it was the pandemic. And here in Minnesota, I think especially challenging, of course it was for everyone, but the killing of George Floyd, all of that together, it's been a hard time. So if you've had some challenges in communication this year, I would just say welcome. You're probably not alone in that. And then it's also really important to understand that we listen and speak with our whole body. Nonverbals communicate a very large percentage of what we say and hear. We don't need to be paranoid. Sometimes I like to say doing this in Minnesota doesn't mean that I'm shut down. It could just mean that I'm very cold and it's January. But again, I just think it's really important that we remember all of us, our full presence also includes our body. So Dan Siegel, who is a psychiatrist at UCLA, talks about the significance of interpersonal communication as really in relationships in general, having this power to shape our brains throughout our lifespan in a really positive way, that we can actively inspire each other to rewire our internal and interpersonal lives towards integration. Social dynamics, relationships are vital to our overall well-being, and we can help each other out in that way. All right, I'm going to switch gears here just a bit and talk about mindfulness. Some of you may be very familiar with mindfulness, but I just like to start with a starting point because it's the foundation for mindful communication. So we describe it as an awareness of one's present moment experience with curiosity, kindness, and a non-judgmental attitude. Mindfulness has been around for over 2,500 years as a meditation practice. It comes to us from Buddhist traditions. We, however, the way we teach it here at the university is a secular approach. However, if you look at most of the world's religions, you'll find a contemplative practice most likely that's very similar to mindfulness. This ability to pay attention to the present moment and not be so pulled, it's so easy for us to be pulled into leaning into the future or leaning back into the past, and rumination and anxiety, of course, can kind of become defaults if we're regularly in one of those two places. There's nothing wrong as well with a mind that wanders. Creativity and innovation can come from that as well. But when we really want to show up, particularly in communication, all hands on deck, being fully engaged and present and alive to someone else is a very, very powerful dynamic. So we also, with mindfulness, bring attitudes of curiosity and kindness. And John Kabat-Zinn likes to use this term, non-judgmental attitude. And what he means by that, I believe, is that many of you probably know this, that we're hardwired with a negativity bias. In other words, our brain's primary function is to keep us alive. And in doing so, it's constantly scanning the environment to seeing what's missing, what's not working, as a way to keep us alert to any threats that might be out there so that we can survive. But these powerful, incredible brains of ours have so much more capacity. And we can train our brains. Not unlike working out, we go to the gym with mindful awareness throughout our daily activities and mindfulness meditation practices. Lots of research has shown us that we can train our brains to be here now, and also to cultivate positive attitudes of kindness, compassion, and caring, self-compassion towards ourselves, and caring towards others as well. I also often like to say that mindfulness is other related. It's not just about me. A powerful dynamic of it is that it involves social and environmental awareness. When we're mindful, we're often able to see and respond to others with greater sensitivity and understanding. So that's what we're going to explore today, this dimension of mindfulness. And there are three key components. These are talked about in the research and literature on mindfulness as well. The first is an intention. Well, cultivating an intention can be really helpful oh yes, I'm going to practice mindfulness as best I can. So intentionally choosing. Mindfulness is an innate capacity that we're all born with. We all have it, but we need to remember, reinforce it, retrain ourselves, given all those variables that are out there that distract us from being here and now. So intention's powerful. The second is attention. This has to do with focus. What we pay attention to really matters. And it also reinforces kind of conditioned patterns and, in fact, neural pathways in our brain. And the third would be attitude. You saw some of those in the description of mindfulness. Kindness, compassion, patience, attitudes that allow us to be at ease with the present moment. And when conversations become a little more difficult, maybe anchor ourselves. So when we talk about mindful communication, I like to talk about it as applied mindfulness or everyday mindfulness. So we're taking what we know about mindfulness and we're applying it right here, right now in our communications. Again, as best we can, and we're not always perfect at it, but that's why we call these things practices, right? Because we practice. There is the work of Oren J. Sofer. I've put his book down on the bottom there, and you might want to write that down, or you'll see this in the PowerPoint that'll come out afterwards as well. But he talks about 3 key principles for mindful communication that I think are terrific. The first is presence takes precedence. Our being nature. So many of us, particularly in the workplace, are doers, right? We're task oriented and getting our job done, but when it comes to mindful communication, we're really entering into that domain of our human beingness. And we lead with presence from the inside out. It's about caring for yourself mindfully and knowing that when we do that, neuroscientists tell us we have mirror neurons, and how we show up in the world has a definite impact on others. It has a ripple effect and it speaks volumes. Right? So we're talking about an engaged presence here. So it starts with us individually first. And intention determines direction. And when we talk about intention, I mentioned that earlier, when it comes to mindful communication, it's about a real deep desire to genuinely connect with someone. It may not be about a kumbaya outcome that we're looking for and everything's going to be perfect, but a real desire to connect human to human, knowing that this being human isn't easy for any of us, right? And so we're working together to connect in ways that can be helpful, in some cases healing as well. We lighten up on our preconceived notions, objectives, and reactive tendencies, right? That we all have triggers, and gently lean into learning, being more authentically curious about the other person's perspective or worldview. Wow, is that really important right now, I think, in the world? Authentically curious about another person's perspective or worldview. Attention shapes experience, seeing beyond our own storylines and our own conditioning and experiencing others' circumstances from a new or different perspective. Maybe practicing, in this situation, what's really called for now? Everything we do is to meet a fundamental need or value that we hold. That's one of Oren J. Sofer's principles. He really leans on the work of nonviolent communication as well, which could be another resource for some of you that may not be familiar with that. And recognizes our shared humanity. Seek first to understand and then problem solve. That fits with what I said earlier as well. So attention shapes our experience. So we turn our attention here to seeing if we could broaden our perspectives. And when I was a mediator, I always used to think to myself, what is it that I'm not seeing or understanding about what that person is saying? How can I inquire a bit more, get a little bit more curious? Curiosity is a fundamentally important piece here when we're talking about mindful communication. So bearing that in mind, curiosity is a key. So I talked about intention and attitude a lot, and some on, attention and attention in that past thing with Oren. But I want to dive a little bit deeper in attitudes. I know I talked about a little bit. But when we talk about mindful communication, there's also a sense of generosity. Of spirit, I'll call it that, a generous spirit that we bring, assuming the best of others, perhaps. And that's not always easy, I know, but we have an optimistic perspective. That doesn't mean we're Pollyanna and, denying what's present, but there's a sense of hope for a future that could look different in the communication that's difficult, or just in general, we have an optimistic perspective. We have an attitude of we versus us versus them, particularly when things get challenging. Mutual respect creates trust and psychological safety. If we really want to encourage people that we work with to feel alive and present and that they can show up as who they really are in the workplace and be welcomed. If we want inclusive communities and workplaces, then we also need to make sure that we're personally and collectively as teams and groups doing whatever we can to ensure one another's sense of psychological safety. Can I show up fully authentically who I am? And can we make mistakes? Some of the initial research on psychological safety from researchers at Harvard was all about, is it all right to make mistakes? Can we learn? Can we become a learning team and a learning organization that way? So psychological safety. And then remembering, empathy is also a really important attitude. It's also a key. Those of you who are familiar with emotional intelligence and leadership, you know what a key part empathy is in that. But empathy and really focusing on our shared humanity, human dignity, rather than our differences. It's so easy. As a matter of fact, the brain likes to go to those differences, right? So let's not think that that's easy for any of us, but we can shift, we can reframe and become, as best we can, a bit more empathetic. We're actually hardwired for empathy, neuroscientists tell us, and that there's 3 types of empathy. The psychologists point out cognitive, intellectual understanding, emotional, we actually are feeling that on a sensation level in the body, maybe what somebody else is. That can also lead to empathy fatigue if we go a little overboard with it. But that's why then we learn about action-oriented or active empathy. Some people call it compassionate empathy. And that's where we actually tie action to it. We don't just get overwhelmed by that empathy, but we choose to take action. Our behaviors reflect that. It could be as simple as wishing someone well, right? Silently or verbally, something like that. But it has action to it. We know that empathy leads to increased trust, a cornerstone of trust, courage to speak up, vulnerability, enhanced information sharing, and an ability to actually collaborate and problem solve. All right. I know I'm giving you a lot of stuff here, but remember, you're going to have this to go back to as well. So the components of mindful communication. First, if we had like a big overarching umbrella, which I'm going to paint here, that's mindful awareness. What I've already talked about, intention, attention, and attitude. And then there are 2 key components. I like to call it full presence listening. I'm all hands on deck. As best I can, I'm really showing up. And that takes some courage sometimes, I think. Holding and receiving the speaker as your focal point, just like some of you who meditate, when we're paying attention to our breath or body sensation, that becomes the focal point. Here, the speaker, we're receiving them with a generous curiosity and openness. We stay grounded in our own body, maybe feeling our feet on the floor and we're feeling a little reactive, taking a couple breaths. There's a lot of self-care involved in that sometimes. And then the second component is wise resonant speaking, guided by that desire to connect with another human being. It's helpful when it's emergent. Sometimes those of you who may have been trained in negotiation know about BATNAs and WANTNAs. In other words, writing everything out that you want. And that can be powerful. I'm not negating that. But when we're really in a conversation with somebody, especially when we're talking about mindful communication, it can be helpful to think of it as emergent. In other words, I'm not rehearsing. I'm not, having listened for a rebuttal and now I'm going to respond. We let all that kind of stuff sit by the side. And instead, we allow ourselves, sometimes it can feel vulnerable, can also have a lot of energy and power in it, to allow the conversation to emerge without second guessing, letting it follow its own course. And also, I think when we're speaking, particularly in teams and meetings, making sure this notion of being inclusive and hearing diverse perspectives, let's make room and also take room. If you're someone who tends to sit back a little bit, do what you need to do to feel safe, or maybe ask for that from others. And then why am I talking is wait. That could be a question you can ask yourself. What's my intention here? And maybe it would be more effective if I step back a little bit, let others speak, or let myself really think about my intention with that and maybe reframe that in a way that might be more helpful or timely. So Those are the key ingredients. Again, we stay grounded in the body and we pause periodically. We also understand the power of silence, pausing between our communications. So full presence listening, I want to just break it down a little bit. I like to think of three, or I'm sure there are more, but I like to think of it when we talk about mindful communication as three broad ways of looking at listening. One would be partial attention, and I think a lot of us do that. If you've ever sat in on a Zoom meeting, how many times I'm sure you've never done this, but maybe you've seen other people answering emails while they're on screen or in a meeting, or maybe they turned off their camera so no one would notice this. Or maybe they've got their phone and they're kind of checking stuff there, right? So a lot of that happens, that distracted kind of, often we're multitasking. And I would say the focus is on me. And we do that at home, we do that at work. I just want you to consider that that's probably not an ingredient of mindful communication. And we all need to work on that one. Be here now. If you're so busy that you can't participate in a meeting, right, because you got so much on your plate, maybe it'd be good to decline that meeting and not be there if you can't really show up, or just figure out a way to handle that. And then there's focus listening. And that's when our attention is really focused on the other and we're hearing the words, but maybe we're listening for rebuttal or preparing our response. So that can be helpful sometimes, but I'm going to take us into the full presence listening. And that's really a whole nother layer. That's where I like to say the magic can happen. It's when you're really present to another person. You're aware of what's not only being said, but how it's being said, the music, the meta language, the nonverbals. And you're also aware maybe of what's not being said. And maybe you're getting really curious about that. And maybe you're in your empathy, you're picking up some things that you want to ask about. You're not making assumptions. Putting yourself in another's shoes with empathy, thinking you can do that, can be a little dangerous. We can make assumptions, but assumptions can get dangerous. So we do a reality check with that. We get curious, and with kindness, we inquire, we engage. There's a lot of energy in full presence listening, as I said earlier, and the focus moves to we. This is a quote from an article I read in Harvard Business Review recently from a man named Peter Bergman. He was talking about being in an interaction with his partner, actually, and he said, all I had to do was listen, but listening isn't easy. Listening, it turns out, is much harder than speaking. We have to allow things we might disagree with to hang in the air, to be present, to allow it. And we have to move over a little and create space for those things to linger. Not always, but sometimes. That kind of listening, he says, takes tremendous courage. I agree. Huge payoffs, but courage. And then another quote from a woman named Monica Sharma, who wrote a beautiful book that I recommend to all of you interested in leadership called Radical Transformational Leadership. And she said, she looks at listening, as many leadership models do, as key to effective leadership. And she says to listen is to heal. And as we do this for ourselves, we create new possibilities, designing and establishing new patterns for equity and justice, for ourselves and others. It allows us to demonstrate our sense of human dignity and respect for others. So I thought it might be nice to just experiment. I hope you guys are up for this, with a mindful listening exercise. It's not going to be long, and you can have your eyes open or closed for this, whichever you prefer. If your eyes are going to be open, I just suggest you have kind of a soft, fixed gaze rather than looking all around the room. That can be helpful. So let's just settle in. Maybe taking another deeper, fuller in-breath and out-breath, and letting all the words I've been saying just recede into the background for now. And bringing your attention to the body and the breath. Our body and breath are always in the present moment. So what a great instrument. How wonderful that is. Maybe feeling your feet on the floor, the weight of your body being held and supported by the chair. Maybe you're noticing temperature, the body, or if you really hone in, maybe a sense of movement of air against exposed skin of the body. And just coming to the natural rhythmic breath just for a moment to say hello to this constant companion, always here for us to come home to ground to the present moment. And now when you're ready, I'm going to invite you to open up now to receiving sound. So allowing that attention on breath to just recede into the background, and instead focusing your awareness now on simply receiving sounds. We're not contriving sound. Sounds in your room. Receiving sounds outside your room. Maybe getting closer and noticing the sounds of your breath, your body breathing. Noticing how sounds come and go, coming out of silence, and they return to silence. Noticing stillness, perhaps, quiet. You may be noticing as well, hearing some sounds for you that you just consider unpleasant, don't really like, or sounds that are pleasant, leaning into those maybe. And notice how easy it is to attach a whole narrative and thought process to liking or disliking thoughts. See if you can let the thoughts just go like clouds in the sky and just come back to the bare awareness of receiving sounds, my voice coming and going, perhaps. And now when you're ready, allowing this focused attention on receiving sounds, hearing, to recede into the background and coming back to an awareness of the body again, the feet on the floor. And maybe taking in one final deep in-breath and out-breath. Thank you for joining me on that exercise. So when we're listening to another in communication, we're also receiving them, just as we receive sound. And it's so easy to be triggered, just as maybe some of you were by an unpleasant sound or really falling into a pleasant or unpleasant, whatever it was. So just experimenting, you can use this type of meditation to help you be a little bit more sensitive maybe when it comes to mindful listening. So I want to talk a little bit about wise resonant speech. I'm focusing a bit more now on listening in this session today, but our communication director developed this terrific model, and he calls it, when communicating online, pick your words. But I think this is a great model anytime. And it's an acronym that might be easy for you to remember. Again, this will be in your handout so you can see it. And this is also on our website if you want to read more about it. But patience and intention, when we pick our words, what we say is really important. And we're all going to make mistakes, so we can help each other out with that too. But here, being patient, taking a breath before you speak at any moment in time can be helpful. Remembering your intention, that what, not only what you want to say, but maybe the overarching one is to really connect human to human here, knowing that it isn't easy for any of us sometimes. Clarity, be mindful about what you communicate, particularly when you're online, be as concise and clear as you can. And then kindness, bringing in those attitudes, kindness being one of the examples of attitude. Remembering how easy all it is for all of us to go into our judgments, to that critical yakety yak voice, that negativity bias that we have can show up, particularly when we're engaged in something stressful in a communication. So bringing in some kindness and care and remembering that, taking a few breaths and reminding yourself and saying out loud in a conversation sometime. I've seen people do this beautifully. You know, this is a really tricky conversation for me and I'd really like to be present, but I'm noticing I'm really triggered right now. Can we talk? I'd like to talk later today or maybe tomorrow about this, but right now I just need to take all this in. Talk about courage, talk about really representing yourself authentically and being a bit vulnerable, but also very effective, right? And that will probably have a ripple effect on the other person as well. And then when you come back, maybe having talked to a trusted colleague or something about it so that you really can be fully engaged in the communication. So this is going to be a summary, a 5-step communication model, I guess, or just a summary. I wouldn't even call it a model. I'd call it a summary of what we've talked about, starting with a pause and a breath, and then revisit that throughout. You know, it's a good way to anchor your attention. Remember, our breath is always in the present moment. So maybe when you get a little distracted or you're going off on what am I having for lunch or whatever that is, take a deep breath, smile at that wandering mind and just come home again. Pay attention again. So you're caring for yourself, particularly when you're reactive, as I just stated in that previous example. Set your intention. And then observe your body. Wow, there's so much wisdom and information in these bodies of ours. So also noticing your thoughts and your emotions and invite ease. Ground yourself in your body throughout. Take a couple deep breaths, as I said earlier, but really the body has a lot of wisdom in it and reveals our emotional state first. Actually, the sensations of emotions are first experienced and felt in the body. So it can be really helpful for you to kind of just do a check-in with yourself now. Full presence listening to self, yourself you're listening to, and to others. Learn to respect silence and the unspoken. Have you ever been in a meeting or you've watched other people just out of nervousness talking, right? And let's be kind to ourselves. That does happen, but it can be really helpful as a mindful communication tool to be effective, to learn about the power of allowing purposeful pauses or silence to show up in between things. Trust emergence, letting go of rehearsing, advising, the need to look good, and instead just be present to what's evolving, be adaptive, and practice wise resonant speaking with a desire to connect. And I might add, do no harm, right? And so those are pretty ambitious, but I want to give you those as our 5 summary points for mindful communication. All right. I'm going to move now into just an overview of mindful meetings, what I mean by mindful team meetings and how that can work. Sometimes I think to engage more people, to hear diverse perspectives and to be more inclusive. We've all been in those meetings where there's been a sage on the stage, right? Or 1 or 2 people that always talk and a few people whose voices you never hear. And everything between A and Z. Or we just pass over that really powerful thing that represented a significant difference that we didn't want to deal with. So we just brushed over it real quickly. So mindful team meetings can be used in a number of ways, but I like to start out with this model that's been around forever, originally created by Dr. Bruce Tuckman. But there's 4 stages of team development. And you folks probably know this one, you've heard it before, but we form, and then we storm as a group or a team. And then, oh yeah, we got to figure out, we create some norms together about how we can behave in ways that work and, guidelines or whatever it might be. And then and only then are we able to perform. So storming is actually seen as a powerful developmental stage. Having differences is powerful. It leads to innovation and creativity and brings about diverse perspectives and engages us in new and different ways of seeing things and solving problems. It's powerful. And so we learn how through meetings and processes, how either to work with those or sometimes not work with all these different phases. There's a lovely approach that was created by Sam Kainer, and I've sort of cited the book there at the bottom. He calls it the diamond of participation, and he labeled something called the grown zone. This was for facilitators, but I just think it's so great for all of us to step back a little bit and say, yeah, we are humanoids, and as such, we go through the grown zone periodically when there's a great deal of difference, disagreement, perspectives that are different, life experiences that are different, that we really need to talk about. Some of those creative conversations, the most important and vital conversations, are probably going to have a larger grown zone there sometimes. But we need to move through, we first have divergent thinking, and we need to open up to that through brainstorming and learning and discovering and dialogue and discussion. That's where we need to start meetings. We need to think about expanding relationship. And then we can move into that task-oriented part where we develop strategies and make proposals and make decisions. That's when those ideas converge. But we need to create space for the divergent thinking and structures and processes for those, so that we have space for the inevitable, of course, grown zone. And then have time to really converge into that and make some really good decisions. So when we talk about mindful meetings, there's some principles I want to share with you. And I know there's quite a bit here, and I probably broke every rule of a PowerPoint, but let me just go through them with you. Clearly, we want to model, and the way that we're looking at it is inclusive, participatory, intentional, engaged, and honoring mindful presence. In other words, it's from the inside out. Each one of us kind of brings our full engaged self to it as well, and then honoring that in others. We apply all those mindful communication principles and practices I talked about earlier in this presentation. It values relationship and task, as I just talked about in that previous model, and relationships come first. And that doesn't mean that we spend forever on that part of a meeting, but we spend some time with dialogue and discussion before we get into the tasks. And we focus on and also the present and the future. We model good self-care, and I might say good group care. We don't book those meetings one right on top the other, right? I know you guys know what I'm talking about, so that we can't even breathe and we're so worn out. There's a sense of hospitality, whether we're on Zoom or when we get back together again. We think about that in the space that we create, and maybe even the food that we serve together. Is it reinforcing well-being with one another? So how do we take care of do we get breaks for bio breaks, but also reflective time? Do we engage tension and differences? Do we see them as team strengths? Maximize interaction and communication. We minimize reports and data and updates. A lot of that can be done by email in different ways. But when we're talking about a mindful meeting, it's really talking about interaction and communication and working together on something in an engaged way, not just sitting back and having one person speak or a couple of people speak. It's awareness of our own and others' privilege and power as well, and structuring that and having processes that are aware of that. We practice equity and airtime. We make space and we take place. We ask that what question I talked about. I know this is a lot, but we began to really think about this. And not only think about it, but we practice it and instill it in what we do. We honor differences in styles and approaches to communication. And our intention here is to have conversations that are co-created. I like that word emergent, I guess. We have openings, we have a middle, and we have a closing. So there's your normal meeting stuff, right? But we really think about collaborative discussion and problem-solving methods together, and consensus-seeking decision-making, I might suggest as well. So if I'm to boil this down here, here's one way that I would look at it in terms of some basics. We always have an opening. there's a mindful transition, just like I did with you at the very beginning. Maybe we just take 3 breaths together, or we just give each other a chance to kind of settle in, maybe get a glass of water, but we're aware that we're transitioning, and now we want to be fully engaged and present. Many people will have a minute of silence or a couple of minutes of just breathing together. Review the meeting purpose and agenda, or the time frame, stuff you probably always do. Meeting guidelines and principles. These are really important. I'll get to them in just a minute, but we co-create them. They can serve as containers for transformation and bravery. I think I got that term from the book that I referenced here in this previous slide, Emergent Strategy, a terrific book. If you want to learn more about specific consensus seeking and collaborative meeting processes, strategies, and methods, that's a really good one for you. So, and then we have brief participant check-ins. How you doing? Some people like to actually start the meeting before they go over all that. They'll do the mindful transition, and then they'll do the check-in, and then they'll go over, get into business. So that's up to you, however you want to do that. And then the collaborative meeting processes, I'm not going to get into that, but that's really the heart of the matter. Thought out processes in alignment with the meeting purpose and objectives. It involves monologues, opportunity for people to actually speak in an uninterrupted fashion, one at a time. Doing round robin around a circle can sometimes be really powerful. And then after that, after everyone's voice has been heard, not just one or two, then we have an open discussion, and maybe there's ideation and decision making that happens from that. There's time for summary and clarifying and quiet reflections and space, maybe some breaks. And there's respectful ways of inviting input from those not participating. And some people may not feel psychologically safe, and we need to be very respectful of that it's invitational in many settings, and holding self and others accountable to the guidelines and the principles. And then, of course, you've got a closing. And I like it not to just be about next steps, but also about what did we learn from this? What was helpful to us in the way we did this? And how might we want to do meetings differently next time? I've got some examples of some guidelines here for you because I think they're just so important. And again, you're going to get this in the handout, but there are many, many other guidelines. And depending upon your organization or team culture or practices or things you've used in the past, you're going to have very different ones maybe than what I've got here. But I just wanted you to have a sense of how you can frame things in a way. And I just pulled these from things I've seen people do or that I've done myself in meetings. So just think about that. I'm sure there are others, and you might want to co-create those with your team. I'm going to conclude here with Celeste Headley. She was a presenter. She did a webinar for us that was terrific on communication. She has a book out, and I've got that down on the bottom here. But she cites 10 ways to have a better conversation that I think are very mindful. And you can read them along with me, but don't multitask. Be present. Don't pontificate. Ask open-ended questions. Powerful. Go with the flow. Be in the present moment. If you don't know, say so. Don't equate your experiences with others. That's that thing that we can be tricky about. Empathy, thinking we can put ourselves in the other shoes of others. Try not to repeat yourself. Stay out of the weeds. Listen, and she bolds that and makes it huge in all her presentations as well, because she says that's the key. And sometimes it can be helpful to be brief. Other times, for some of you, being brief is not what you need to do. You really need to share things. So just some guidelines for you to consider and think about. And I know that I've said a whole lot now, so I'm about to move into questions, and I'm going to turn this over to Mary Jo in the remaining minutes we have. But I'll leave you with this quote from Celeste. Be amazed. All right.
Well, Mariann, there are some great questions. So, I'm going to begin with the first one. Do you have suggestions for how to better use full presence listening when you are in a situation where your role is to quickly summarize what people are saying and move to suggested, expected action steps? Are there a couple of sentences that we could say to create the space for thinking time?
Yeah, I think you've just kind of answered that one yourself from my perspective. But, before you move on, just, if somebody has said some things and you're the one who it sounds like is responsible for summarizing and moving things on, I literally think just taking what my colleague Janice Monterino has coined as taking a purposeful pause, taking just a breath for a moment. And I think that can be really helpful, just slowing it down for just a second, maybe a couple of breaths and saying, thanks, everyone. That was a really powerful contributions that you all made. And just pausing for a moment on that recognition, that appreciation of that, and then moving in to the next step or to a recommendation or whatever the summary might be that you need to do. But I think just even a moment or two of silence, of taking a breath and acknowledging and appreciating what you've heard.
So a follow-up question to that, Mariann, somebody asks, what would be some good phrases to use to invite input?
Yeah, I think anything that's really opening. Sometimes I'm in a team, I'll say something like, is there anyone, if anyone I haven't heard from yet, I'd love to hear if you'd like to speak. So just something like that, any of those who we haven't heard from yet. And that also kind of puts on alert those who are ready to come in with the second thing. You may have seen I had an expression in the guidelines where I said, please don't speak a second time until others have had a first. I found sometimes that can be really helpful and powerful. But just any other ideas? Is there another way of looking at this that some of you may see that we're not seeing yet? So just that curiosity, framing it as an open-ended question with an authentic curiosity and a desire to hear, I think goes a long way.
So Mariann, somebody writes, I have found that many folks, including supervisors, understand that the groan zone, they understand that as an issue or something to be avoided, is they understand these things as conflict. How can we work together to shift this understanding and understand conflict with mindfulness?
Yeah, that is a really great question. Let's all acknowledge I was born and raised here. We live in Minnesota nice. And we tend to be, I don't want to do a sweeping thing here, but I think a lot of work cultures, and for a number of reasons, tend to be conflict avoidance. So I think it's a cultural issue, literally an organizational cultural issue that is bigger than just individuals or teams and how you communicate. So I think addressing that in many different levels, some of that could be through training and education, can be really helpful, because I think once people develop more skills around this, they have more confidence in addressing conflict. So I will say that, and mindful communication as well can be one of those tools of many that people can learn to help with that. But I also think just starting where you're at. So if you're the leader of your team, or have some influence on your team and want to experiment with some of these things, try it out in small ways first and build it up and see what you can do within the confines of your own team. Take some small risks, not huge ones. And again, considering and making sure that there's that sense of psychological safety. Building trust over time, I think, is really important in order to be able to go through some of that groan zone together. But I do think training and skills and taking a look at some of the larger cultural influences, but start small, start in your own team and do what you can.
So Mariann, this is a really good question. What are some ideas on how to be clear that I'm listening to understand and that my silence doesn't necessarily mean agreement or that I have nothing to say? I like and value rapid fire communication back and forth. It feels like collaborative conversation.
Yeah, I'm with you. That energy of an alive, engaged, that's mindful communication, by the way. When you're really into wise, resonant speech and discussion, that aliveness is there. So don't think that it's not there in that phase. If, however, you're really trying to listen to somebody, I would just say it out loud. I'm somebody, if somebody that knows you could say, as you probably know, I'm somebody who really likes to get in there, engage, but I'm really trying to hone my listening skills more. Be vulnerable, get it out there, just say it. And so I'm really going to practice, make it overt. I'm going to practice actually just listening more. And when you're all done, I'm going to check in with you and see if I got it right before I start expressing my own opinion, because I'm really great at doing that. And that's an asset that I have, but I'm really trying to develop other skill sets too. And this listening is one of them. So I would just label it. I would just say it for what it is and put it out there and see it as a practice. That's a good modeling too, I think, for other people in the workplace.
Well, thank you so much, Mariann. There have been wonderful comments in the chat, so I hope you have an opportunity to review those. I want to also acknowledge and thank all of the staff at the Bakken Center who helped make today's webinar possible. We hope that you'll join us for our next webinar on June 9th for an information session about our mindfulness programs, and on June 17th for a presentation about social somatics, the alchemy of returning to embodied campus coexistence. We hope you'll also sign up for our online Mindfulness at Work course. We'll send a link to you about that course in the post-webinar email. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Mary Jo.